Let me preface this video by saying that this review is not going to be overly positive. I kind of flip-flopped about making a video that contains a lot of criticism from myself, but I decided that if I really want to establish myself as a video game reviewer, I should probably just share my opinion as is and let people decide if they agree with me or not. Now, I will say that there is nothing wrong with having a different opinion from myself, and I don't think that one critical review of a game is enough to ruin its entire reputation. But with all this kind of out of the way, I will start with everything I like about Xenoblade Chronicles, and then I'll get into some of my criticisms, and I'll let you decide at the end if you think that this game was worth playing or not. I'll start with the story aspect because I do think it's the biggest highlight of Xenoblade Chronicles, and I start by saying that the plot is actually not very groundbreaking, but it's executed very well. It provides a lot of good motivation for players to continue playing the game, and it is engaging throughout pretty much the entire experience. I think it's a little slow at first, but it doesn't really take too long to get off the ground, and it pretty much carries a lot of energy throughout the entire game, which is impressive given how long it takes to complete an entire playthrough of Xenoblade Chronicles. The plot is also supported by just a really good character cast. I like pretty much everybody in the party. There's good motivations for each of the character while still maintaining a pretty solid amount of variety. I do like some characters more than others, but I think that every character gets a lot of very solid development, and they're all pretty generally likable. I also just think that generally Shulk is a great protagonist. It has a lot of cool dynamic how he's a researcher and not someone who has a ton of combat experience and is thrust into a role where he's very unfamiliar, but because of his research background and the way that he approaches things much more analytically, he has his own unique strengths rather than just raw firepower. And it's cool that there's this dynamic they build between him and Dunban, who Dunban is like the one who is just the raw firepower, and Shulk is the one who has to be more analytical about things. And Dunban is someone who can recognize Shulk's greatness in his own strengths without having to really compare themselves directly. It's all really cool, and it helps build up a lot of these characters throughout the plot, and it just shows a lot of really good moments between them. I think it's part of what really makes Xenoblade's story so entertaining, is just watching characters grow and change throughout the story and see how they can learn to appreciate themselves and what they offer to the party. It's all really nice. On top of this, you just have really good world building. I think that the premise itself is already cool, just the idea of the entire setting taking place on two giant colossal monsters that have died thousands of years ago and everything is living on top of them is just a cool idea in general, and it's also executed pretty well in this game. It helps tie into a lot of the overall themes of the games, and it just creates some absolutely magical moments. The game also will just contain many breathtaking areas. I think there might be a little bit of people kind of complaining that the game is only in 720p, but I really couldn't care less. I think this game looks fantastic. There are just moments where you do have to stand and just take in the scenery because of how great everything looks. And all while this is all going on at the same time, from the breathtaking visuals, you also get an amazing soundtrack. I think that the world music is always very good. I don't really dislike too many songs in this game, and I will say that it all just fits the areas very well. The only minor complaint I have with this is I don't really like the beginning battle theme, which is Time to Fight, but that's just a personal preference. The only downside is that is the song that you hear for most of the game, and given that I wasn't a huge fan of it, it kind of wore on me a little bit. But it completely makes up with it the fact that I love mechanical rhythm. I think it's one of the best battle themes in many games that I've played. And on top of this, You Will Know Our Names is just a really hype song anytime you're doing any of the unique monster fights. I think those two really stand out to me as some of the best music that this game has to offer. On top of this is actually pretty unique for me, but I like the English dub of Xenoblade Chronicles. I'm usually pretty against a lot of dubs just because I'm so used to watching subtitled anime that I always prefer to play with the Japanese voices, but I think they do a really good job with this dub. It's got a lot of good solid voice acting throughout it, and it definitely gives it its own unique tone. I did play through the game on the Japanese dub in the most recent version that I played just because I wanted a different experience, but I honestly didn't have a preference between the two of them. I think they're both pretty good. And that pretty much concludes a lot of the stuff that I have to praise about this game. You'll kind of notice an overall theme though between everything that I praise about Xenoblade Chronicles. I have not really touched on gameplay at this point in time, so let's kind of dive into some of the big criticisms that I have for Xenoblade Chronicles, which is almost entirely gameplay focused. I'm going to start with the biggest issue that I have with this game, and it's how big it is. Xenoblade Chronicles is a game that is too big for its own good, and this is seen in a lot of ways throughout my entire playthrough experience, but I will say this much. The world acts as an amazing backdrop to the scenery, but playing in it is just a huge chore. This is because the movement sucks. It takes so long to get places, you never feel like you move fast enough, and on top of this, you just can't jump over railings and stuff that you feel like you should be able to at any given time. It's so frustrating to be a player and feel like you should be able to move a specific way because the world looks like you can, only to be rejected by the movement system. That frustration is something I felt from start to finish throughout the entire experience, and it gets incredibly frustrating. On top of this, these massive worlds, they do kind of encourage you to explore it, but a lot of times when you go out of your way to explore new areas, you just run into a high-level monster that instantly deletes you upon entering it. And it's very different from playing something such as Soulsborne, where you could stumble upon a really difficult enemy, and usually it's easy to just run away, or if you're just good enough at the game, you can beat the enemy anyways. You don't have anything like that in Xenoblade Chronicles. If you're level 10 and you run into a level 80 enemy, you're done. You're just gonna die and get sent back to the fast travel point. And while we're on the topic of fast traveling, it feels like you don't have enough of these fast travel points located throughout the world. They're so spread out that it can still take a long time to get to common quest objectives, even from the nearest fast travel point. Backtracking through the same areas multiple times again and again just gets so dull. I think the first time I walk through areas is very cool and engaging, but once I've seen it and I keep seeing it over and over again, it's just less exciting every time I go back to these areas. I think some good examples of this would be something like Aerith Sea, where most of the map takes place on these floating islands and you teleport between them. You can already kind of get an idea that the map itself is actually much more condensed, because while you could jump off on the islands and swim in the ocean, there's nothing down there. There's just so much empty space in between everything, and it's all there just to make everything feel massive without actually providing any interesting content in between it. This is something that I think a lot of people criticize games for, and it's also not something that I think people criticize this game for. But I do think it comes off pretty poorly in this title specifically, because I can honestly say that a lot of my playthrough is just wandering around constantly. And that wandering is not very fun for me. It's not like there's anything interesting while you're wandering around. It is just a lot of dead time walking between objectives, and if the world was about a quarter of the size that it is, it would have accomplished the exact same things in terms of gameplay without having to just add all this extra padding for time. In addition to its massive size, the NPC system will also start to drive you insane the more that you play the game. So on top of NPCs being incredibly spread out among these massive towns, the NPCs will also have different active times of day and walk around between a bunch of different points where you can find them. On one hand, this does make the game feel much more alive, and that the NPCs actually, occupy and live in the world and do things. But once again, as a player, it is incredibly annoying to try to track down NPCs. You have to go into the menu, look at their active times, try to figure out what areas that they're constantly in, and it's just not easy to find people if you want to. If you want to do all the quests in this game, you have to talk to every single named NPC in an area, whether or not they have a quest marker above them or not, and doing that is just such a massive chore. It's not fun at all, and there's a good reason why most games just deadbolt their NPCs to the ground, because it's just much more convenient from the player perspective. And on top of this, it's like, do you really want players just sitting there flicking through the clock to try to find NPCs at different locations? It's so unintuitive, and I usually just spend a lot of my time looking at a Wikipedia page while trying to go to an area just to see all the different things that I can do and where all the NPCs are. It should not be this inconvenient to access all the content in the game. I think a lot of people miss so many of these side quests simply because it's hard to find them, and it's not because it's like hidden in a really interesting way. It's just you didn't know that an NPC was active in a specific area at a specific time of day. And finding that stuff out after the fact made me even more upset, because I was trying to go out of my way to access as much content as I could, and the fact that I still managed to miss things in ways that were just basically hidden in plain sight is something that's not really fun for me. On top of this, the battle system I think is actually pretty fun overall. I like just clicking on arts, doing damage, using different skills, leveling them up. It gives you a lot of customization options, which is nice, and it feels like you can kind of build characters to your preference. The only thing I don't like is the aggro system. I don't really like these complex aggro systems in my single player games where I do not have direct control over my allies. When you have ally NPCs that need to maintain aggro in order for your battles to be successful, it just feels like you want to be able to control them more consistently so that you don't get punished for dealing too much damage in a specific segment. If I'm trying to optimize my damage, a lot of times I can end up getting punished, and the AI can end up making weird choices that cost you a battle. I played through the same boss fight 3 times because Ricky decided that healing the party was not something he wanted to do until my 4th time fighting the boss. That shit is aggravating, and it happened consistently to me throughout the playthrough. You could say I didn't build my characters properly, but when the AI behaves a specific way and I succeed and then the AI performs poorly and I lose, that's something that is not cool because it's not something that I have direct control over, and it's why this is like the one aspect of the battle system that just absolutely drove me insane. The other thing with the battle system that I'm not a big fan of is the vision mechanic. I think the vision mechanic is cool about the first time it happens, and then after about the 200th time it happens, it's pretty old by that point. You've seen almost everything that they can do with visions by the first time that you see the vision mechanic. An enemy just uses a talent art and you have to use Monado's shield, or it uses a different art and you have to use Monado's speed. There are a few moments in this game where they finally change up how visions are used in battle, but it's very rare and it's not something that was done consistently. They seriously did not need to use visions in battles as often as they did, because it's just really annoying when it happens that like almost every unique monster has a talent art that requires Monado's shield. Yippee. On top of this, it also forces you in many important story fights to use Shulk. Something that every character in this game should have had was some kind of Monado shield equivalent that everybody could use, so that you could just use whatever party you want on every single fight. And while it might seem kind of weird because Shulk is supposed to be the one that uses visions, I think you can break some immersion experiences to make the game a little bit more fun to play for people. The other reason why I find this to be a bit weird is just because they handled visions very well in every other aspect in this game. It's honestly cool to be able to find a collectible and know how much of that collectible you'll need for a future side quest thanks to a vision. It's also convenient when you're doing a side quest that has multiple options. You can already know the exact outcome of it because you'll see a vision of how that affects things in the future. All of that's really cool, and they play around the vision mechanic very well in every other aspect of the game, and it's just kind of pointless in the battle system almost. I do feel like I kind of hammered this point a little bit too much, but my general thing is that visions in battle I find to be pretty bad, but I think visions everywhere else in the game are handled very well. And the last thing I'll kind of talk about is just the questing system in general. There are 400 side quests in this game, and I think a very small percentage of them actually feel cool. A lot of them just repaste the same content from area to area, so it's just the exact same thing with a different coat of paint on it, so either fighting a different enemy or just finding a different collectible. This is something that I'm not saying is inherently bad. The only issue is that when you repaste the content over and over again across a game as large as this one, it just gets very tiresome the more you interact with it. Thankfully, there are some really interesting side quests to do in the game, in addition to a lot of the mundane ones. They're just not as common. So you end up in this weird position where you're unsure if you want to accept a bunch of side quests, because you might just end up getting a lot of really lame ones, and then only on occasion does it finally give you some fun ones at the end. Overall, I much would have rather had this game have about 200 quests that were a lot more interesting than just a lot of boring ones that didn't feel like they really added anything interesting to the gameplay. And this is where I kind of get to my conclusion on this whole thing. I myself am not someone who really finds the gameplay to be very fun in Xenoblade Chronicles. I am a person who feels like this game is much more fun in theory than it actually is in practice. And the real issue that you have is that I think when this game originally came out, a lot of the stuff was much more forgivable because it was very ambitious for what it was trying to do at the time. The issue that you have is in a modern context today, this game is being charged at $60, so it is considered to be like as good of quality as every other JRPG that you can play in the modern era. And I don't really see this sitting up there with a lot of the greats that you currently have to compete with. Overall, it's not something that I think is really easy to get into. If you are somebody who has a lot of patience and you're willing to get through a lot of the more mundane parts of this game, I think at its core you have a really interesting story and there's a lot of great content that people get really excited about, because there is a lot of good content to experience here, but it's just muddled with a lot of mundane tasks on top of it. It puts me in this weird position where I'm not always sure if I really want to recommend this game to somebody. And that's where I go ahead and say this much. From my own personal perspective, the gameplay left a lot to be desired for me, and I wish that they iced out some of the more lame parts of this game, because over like the 100 hours I played the game, I think about 50 hours of this content was absolutely exciting and very engaging, and then 50 hours of it was me just sitting there being frustrated and wishing that I could get to the good parts of the game again. I don't do rating systems here at the end of my whole review. I just kind of lay everything out on the board. But overall, I don't really particularly like Xenoblade Chronicles, because for me, it's not worth it for me to waste a ton of time to get to the good content. It almost feels like the best way to experience Xenoblade Chronicles is to just look at a playthrough that somebody else has created where they've cut out a lot of the more uninteresting parts of the game.